Robert's been involved with the Sierra Club since he was 12 years old. His dad took him on a hike to the top of Mount Olomana, and he fell in love with the Aina, and he's been working for the Sierra Club ever since. He's been our director for the last 2 years, and once again, I'd like to recognize him. Take it away, Robert.
Thank you, Anthony. I, in a draft email, poked fun a little bit at Anthony, and I thought by not introducing me, he was trying to get some revenge. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Paul, for wonderfully astute comments. This is a topic that we could spend the whole day talking about and still not scratch the surface of all the issues. So let me be very frank. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the systemic challenges, very briefly, not in the depth it deserves. And we're going to talk about a possible idea that we might try and push this year. But again, it doesn't solve all the problems. It's a start. And that's all we can probably do, because you take the baby steps and eventually get to where you want to go. So let's talk about two issues with regards to agriculture in Hawaii. Claire referenced land use. In Hawaii, currently, there are approximately on Oahu, there's 33,000 homes that are currently authorized to proceed. I mean, they may not have building permits necessarily, but from a regulatory perspective, they're fully vested. The landowner can go ahead and proceed and build these homes. There's really not much that the state or counties can do to say, well, maybe we've changed our minds, maybe we need to reconsider. There's currently approximately 12,000 new homes in the pipeline. That's just looking at two projects in Oahu. Ho'opili and Koa Ridge would be 12,000. Both would dump onto what's been rated the second worst freeway in the United States. And there's additional proposals that are popping up, like, for example, the Envision Laie you may have heard of. It's 10,000 new homes in the Laie area. And so at the end of the day, we're seeing a lot of growth. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Growth is okay, but it may not be handled in the most sophisticated way. We tend to handle it on a case-by-case basis. We tend to look at each project in isolation without a lot of data. There is no statewide, there is no island-wide agricultural plan, for example. How are we going to grow our food? Where are we going to go? That level of detail has never been articulated. And so when we examine these projects, they tend to be examined in isolation. We tend to say, do we want growth or not? And that's sort of how the argument is framed. And for example, the construction industry over the past decade has doubled in size. That just shows, it was a housing boom. We exploded in growth both on Maui, on the Kona side of the Big Island. We've seen tremendous growth in this industry, perhaps too fast. Perhaps too many people went in that area, and now we see a tremendous amount of people unemployed in that area, and they're desperately looking for jobs. The reality is that industry probably grew too fast, and it's probably going to shrink too fast, and that's just something we can't necessarily do much about. But what happens when we have a project comes up like Koa Ridge? Koa Ridge, just a brief example, and it's just an example. When it's first proposed as 1,200 acres, it's now been shrunk down to 700 acres. The Sierra Club's been involved in this project for at least a decade. Jeff helped spearhead it, and we're still continuing. Koa Ridge is a plot of land that's been growing food productively. Every year it's made a profit. It does produce a fair amount of food that we do eat. It's one of the last green belts. If you're kind of looking from Honolulu all the way to Wahiawa, it's one of the last sort of green sections before you have interrupted city from Hawaii Kai to Wahiawa. And it employs a number of people. Expected gross revenue is approximately $2 million per year. So it's good land. It's some of the best prime farmland that we have in the state, in fact. But what happens when we have this project come up to the Land Use Commission is 100, 200 carpenter labor unions come in and say, we need jobs. And there isn't really that data to come back and say, wait a second, how are we going to get to that type of food self-sufficiency that we need? What are we going to do about food? That argument tends to be very fuzzy, it tends to be very abstract, and doesn't get a lot of recognition, unfortunately. So that's one sort of obstacle. Let's talk about another obstacle. Even if you have a plot of farmland, let's say it's yours, you own it, there's probably 30 different things you can do on ag land, fully under the law. And of those, one of them is growing food. And those other 29, and some of them may pay you better. And so there's naturally going to be that economic pressure to say, well, what should I do with my land? Is it going to be growing food, or is it going to be doing something else? And that's just a reality, and we have to recognize it. And then finally, let's take one small example. Schools. Let's say, for example, we want to have local food in local schools. What are some of the hurdles to that? And again, I'm just going to really quickly power through this. Let's say, Paul comes along and says, I want to provide some school to my food for my local school. That school's going to say, well, we have a state procurement contract. We do. Can you negotiate for the whole state? Can you provide food for every school here? Can you provide for a year-long's worth amount of food? Paul's probably going to hopefully say, well, I only have, stuff coming in, and I don't know exactly when it's going to come in. I don't know how much it's going to come in. It's going to be hard for me to commit to providing food for every school in the state. Frankly, as it gets more and more complicated, farmers want to farm, and some of these other issues get trickier and trickier, like having the health permitting regulations to make sure that we meet federal and state health standards that we have to, they have to overcome. And so it just gets more and more complicated. Are there solutions to these? Absolutely. And we've seen some of them. I mean, there's definitely some individuals that are really doing some tremendous work and trying to overcome these problems, like having a local distributor that says, hey, bring me all the food you grow. I will handle the distribution. I will handle some of the procurement contract stuff that we can do to make sure this moves forward. So there's solutions, but the reality is that there isn't that overall vision, that overall leadership. And so the concept that we'd like to suggest, and we're directly stealing it from the clean energy realm, which is in clean energy, we pass what's called renewable portfolio standards. And essentially say the state is going to get to a certain amount of energy by a certain date. So you saw Jeff refer to the 40% by 2030, 45%. Nobody's correcting me. That's 40. 70% clean energy, 40% through electricity. And so the idea there is that you have an industry where you're able to impose those standards and actually have some enforcement capacity if we don't achieve that. And trying to adopt some of that concept and apply it to the food arena and saying, let's say by 2020, we're going to grow 20% of our food. Let's say by 2030, 30%. And, roughly 5 decades ago, we were growing close to 50% of our food. So we know that these goals are achievable. We know that we can get to that direction. But by setting that standard, and again, it's no silver bullet. Let me stress that. It is not a silver bullet, but it outlays that standard. It says Department of Ag, this is where we're headed. It says, to the legislature, by adopting it as a public policy, that this is a priority. This is something that we need to have, just like water, just like electricity. We have to make sure we have that sufficiency in food. And by doing all of that, we hopefully are able then to align the financial resources, find folks like the ones sitting to the left of me to say, all right, now let's overcome some of these other problems that we need to do. Now, goals by themselves are great. We used to have a goal saying that we're going to reduce our Opala by 50% by the year 2000. Well, goals by themselves don't mean much. You actually have to have some type of enforcement capacity. So let's go ahead and connect one of the primary difficulties, which is land, availability of land, long-term use of land, and let's connect it to these standards and say, if we don't achieve these standards, 20% by 2020, 30% by 2030, maybe 50% by 2040, that we're going to stop the large land use reclassifications, the huge redevelopments for development, and say we're going to just go ahead and say we're not going to allow that until we've actually achieved these standards. That puts the pressure on everybody to make sure we're actually getting to these standards, and to make sure that landowners comes and sit at the table and say, all right, we understand, we've got to do this, how do we do it?